Good evening. Chantawash na pe choose apelo. You're supposed to say yes. It is a greeting. It's a formal greeting in my language, Lakota. It has two meanings. One is colloquial and one is literal. The literal meaning is, with a good heart, I shake your hand. And colloquially, it means I take your hand in friendship. So you take your pick. It's in the spirit of either one of those that I come here tonight. And I think whoever it was, John mainly, that had the audacity to invite me back again. I must have said something right, or the last time, or I didn't insult enough of you last time. But anyway, I'm glad to be here, back at this place. Joanne and Joe and my wife and I have been friends for a long time. And now Joanne and I carry the same burden. My wife was with me the last time we were here, 5 years ago. And shortly after we were here, we found out she was diagnosed with colon cancer. And she died shortly after that. But she talked a lot about our visit here. She was impressed with this place. She liked especially the Vespers that we participated in the last time. She spoke fondly about that. So I'm really, really glad to be back here. It's good to see all of you who are interested in tonight's topic. So we're going to try to make this low-tech affair work somehow. A lot of literature has been written about black elk, and a lot of Native issues and events and people in general have been written about by non-Native people. Take the Battle of the Little Bighorn, for example. That had nothing to do with tonight's topic. But over the years, there have been over 9,000 books, documentaries, scholarly articles, and whatnot written about that one event. And all but 18 or 19 of those have been by non-Native people. So, and it's in the general sense, it's good that we learn about things. But I think it's even more important that we learn from a perspective of the insider, from those who are part of the topic, or have lived the topic, or have lived the event. Now, having said that, I'm not passing myself off as an authority on black elk, because I'm not. I will come from the perspective of being part of the culture and being something of an elder. Now, I say that with tongue in cheek. Chronologically, I'm an elder. And with being an elder comes wisdom, and I'm still waiting for that to kick in. So let's just say you're gonna listen to an opinionated old Lakota man. Let's just leave it at that. So in order so that we're all thinking along the same lines, I'm going to give you a brief history and a glimpse into what Lakota is before we get into black elk. The Lakota are part of a nation that is on the Central Plains. The other two parts are the Dakota and the Nakota, with an D and an N. Same word, different pronunciation. Same meaning. And the word means allies or an alliance of friends. So those are three parts of one single nation, and the Lakota were the westernmost and the largest part of that conglomerate. And there are 7 bands of the Lakota, even then and today. And you can see on the screen where they are. And I've listed them in order of the size of population, more or less. The Oglala are the most numerous. Their name means to scatter or to look for a home. And after that comes the Hunkpapa, and their name means to camp at the end. And all of these names came from some event or something that these groups were known for. And then after that is the Sichangu, which means the burnt thigh people. Some of my ancestors were involved in a horrific prairie fire way back before the time of horses, and that's where the name comes from. And when he's planted by the water, Ohe is 2 kettles or 2 boiling, and so on and so forth. So those are the 7 bands of the Lakota. And black elk, of course, was an Oglala. And this is what our territory once looked like. And if you recognize the state, this is our territory superimposed on the current state boundaries up in the north central plains. And if you recognize the states, South Dakota is squarely in the middle. East of the Missouri River, which is in the middle of South Dakota and up into North Dakota, east of the Missouri River are the Dakota and the Nakota. Everything west all the way to Wyoming, the Bighorn Mountains, up into Montana, and down into Nebraska is Lakota territory. So this entire territory at one time was bigger than most European countries of the day. And it isn't that we owned it and established hard boundaries, we just controlled the territory. We were part of the environment. So this is what it looked like back in the day. Thank you very much. And these are the current reservations as they look now. At the topmost, it looks like one reservation, but actually it's two. There should be a line roughly in the middle of the two up in north central South Dakota. At the top is Standing Rock. At the bottom is Cheyenne River. And there are two small reservations in the center. There are two reservations instead of one. There are 8 Lakota reservations. So this is what the map looks like relative to our reservations right now. The current population of Lakota people is somewhere around 100,000. And 70,000 of us live in South Dakota. The rest of us are scattered across the country. Black elk's name in Lakota is Hechaka Sapa. And that's just literally black elk. But in our language, the noun always comes first. So it's elk black, Hechaka Sapa, black elk. And this is a very brief biography of black elk. He was born in Wyoming, in north central Wyoming, in sometime around 1863. And he died on the Pine Ridge Reservation in 1950. So he lived to be almost 87 years old. So he had a long life. And it's what happened in that life is the reason we're here this evening, and is the reason for a lot of scholarly interest in the man. Now again, I'm not purporting to be an expert on black elk. I just want to simply give you a perspective on why he's such an interesting person. And this is my personal background. Not that I'm important. I just want you to understand where I'm coming from. Pure and simple. On my mother's side, I'm Sichangu Lakota, one of those 7 bands. On my father's side, I'm Oglala Lakota. And this is not an unusual situation for people to come from different lineages, from any one of those groups. And in our society, we are a matriarchal society. So we identify ourselves first by our mother. That's why I list the Sichangu first, because my mother is Sichangu. And I'm about 1/8 French. There's a darn Frenchman in the woodpile somewhere. Actually 2. You're probably wondering why I have the name Marshall, M-E-R-S-H-A-L-L, which is English. When my great-grandfather, Joseph Marshall I, and his brother Francois came from France, they came to Canada, migrated all the way across Canada, and eventually back down into what is now Wyoming and South Dakota and so forth. And they were young when they first came, and when they came down into the Dakotas and Wyoming, they had the common sense to marry Lakota women. Both of them did, and raised very big families. When my great-grandfather Joseph got married, he was married by an Anglican priest. And in those days, the marriage certificate was a legal document. So this Anglican priest took my great-grandfather's name spelled M-A-R-E-S-C-H-A-U-L-T, Marshall, and spelled it M-A-R-S-H-A-L-L. Why the hell he did that, I don't know. probably because he was English. So therefore, because I was a legal document, we were Marshall from there on. So that's why I have the name Marshall. I am a first language Lakota speaker. I was raised by my maternal grandparents, and their first language, Lakota. That's all I learned up until the age of 8. I heard English once a day from a radio station that told the news from 6 to 6:15 every day. And it was, of course, it was in English. So that was the only English I heard consistently for a lot of years. I'm still learning English. Perhaps most important to this discussion is the fact that 2 of my great-grandfathers and a nephew are Lakota medicine men. And I'll tell you more about one of those great-grandfathers later on. But I've heard stories about both of them over the years, and what kind of abilities they had, what kind of helpers they had, what kind of men they were, and so forth. So I was inculcated with those kind of stories as I was growing up. And right now, one of my nephews is a medicine man. And I've seen him do some extraordinary things. So again, it's from that perspective. Fortunately or unfortunately, there was a lot of Christian influence also in my family. My paternal grandfather, Charles Marshall, was an ordained Episcopal deacon. And my mother's younger brother, who is now 88, because my mother is 90, is an Episcopalian priest. And 3 of my 7 brothers are Pentecostal ministers. So I'm totally surrounded. But I'm still holding my own. I am not a Christian. I am a Lakota. I'm a practicing traditional Lakota. And we'll talk about a little bit more about that later. But this is the perspective I'm coming from this evening. Almost forgot about our low-tech affair here. Oops. There we go. There we go. So we have 2 personas when it comes to Black Elk. We have a Hihaka Sapa, who was born a Lakota, grew up a Lakota, answered the calling to be a healer, a medicine man, as we called him, at some point in his life. And then later on, in his 40s, he becomes Nicholas Black Elk because he joined the Catholic Church. So those are the 2 things we'll talk about more or less. And as you see, I put up there, he was called to be a Wapia with Kasha and a Wishasha Wakan. Those are 2 different things. And then later on in his life, of course, he converted to Christianity. So what is a Wapia Wichasha or a Wichasha Wakan? And it's very simple to label and to define. Harder to explain. A Wapia Wichasha literally means the man who fixes. He's a fixer. Now, in certain cultures and certain segments, that would be taken an entirely different way. And a Wichasha Waka is literally a holy man. Someone who becomes a fixer, someone who becomes a Wapi Wichasha, or in the more popular vernacular, medicine man, does not immediately become a Wichasha Waka. It's not synonymous. It doesn't happen at the same time. That comes later with years and years and years of experience and the acquisition of age and wisdom. And some medicine men don't ever reach that stage. Some medicine men are only medicine men. They're only healers, the fixers. Some of them do not become holy men or Wichasha Waka. And as it indicates here, both describe the same person. My nephew, who is a medicine man, is 63. And he'll be the first to tell you 2 things. That he isn't wise, and that he wishes to high heaven that he was not a medicine man, because it's a difficult path. It's not a career choice. One does not wake up one morning and say, oh, I think I'll become a medicine man. Doesn't happen that way. I mean, we decide to become teachers or plumbers or pilots or whatever. But becoming a medicine man is not like that at all. The spirits pick you. And most of the people who become medicine men, who become healers, resist it as much as they can, as my nephew did, and as I'm sure my 2 great-grandfathers did. But I have seen him do some very mystical things, some very mind-boggling things in the process of healing people. And I'll tell you one of those events, and it's up to you to believe it or not. Another nephew of mine was suffering from cancer. He, as it turned out, developed a cancerous tumor on his abdomen, in between his skin and his muscles. So that's where it was situated. It was growing and growing like a pancake. Eventually it got to the size of a big, large pancake. And it was causing him a lot of pain. It was killing him. He went to the Mayo Clinic in Rochester. He spent several episodes there and subjected to chemotherapy and radiation treatment, which did not help. So essentially, at the age of 43, he went home to die. And I finally talked him into going to see my other nephew in hopes that something could be done, some healing could be brought about, or even just a little bit of remission. So we did. We went to see my other nephew. And after several visits, Lessard said, yes, we'll try to do something for Lewis. So there were several ceremonies. There was a ceremony called Uripi, which in Lakota means to be tied up. That's what happens to the medicine man in this ceremony. And there's prayer, there are songs of invitation to bring the spirits in, and then there are prayers for healing. And it's done in a setting where as many people who want to participate to come and help and pray can in this ceremony. So for Lewis, there were like 30 people in the ceremony, and each one of us prayed. And then the medicine man, Lessard, prayed as well and communed with the spirits, his helping spirits who came into the ceremony. And they gave him information about medicine to pick, to use as a tea to help heal my nephew Lewis. And that's what he did. He went out and found the medicine, dried it, made it into a tea, and gave instructions to Lewis to drink it for a period of time, which he did faithfully. At the last ceremony, and up to this point, it's a very ordinary story. This is what usually happens in the healing process when a medicine man is administering or helping a patient. But it's the last ceremony that I still remember. Now we're just my 2 nephews and my nephew Lessard's wife, because she was his helper. She's called pipe carrier. And I were in an isolated area. We built a campfire. And Lessard burnt some cedar chips, some large cedar chips. And when they had burned down to coals, red hot coals, and Lewis was standing there, he was instructed to remove his shirt because the tumor was still there. We could see that little bit of protuberance here on this side of his abdomen. And it felt hot to the touch. When those embers had burned down to hot glowing coals, my nephew, the medicine man, reached into the bed of embers, grabbed one with his fingers, put it in his mouth, and then blew at that affected area. And if you've ever seen a blowtorch, that's exactly what it looked like. Blue flame directed at that affected spot. And my nephew Lewis didn't flinch one time. All he felt was a little bit of warmth, not a lot of heat. He did this 4 times. He blew until the coal had expired in his mouth. He took it up, threw it away, grabbed another one, and did the same thing 4 times. I've seen that happen before. Another medicine man did the same thing that I observed years and years before as a child. But this time I was an adult. This was like 5 years ago. And then the ceremony was over. We prayed, and then we all went home. And then 3 weeks later, when Lewis went back up to the Mayo Clinic, guess what? There was no tumor. None. Now you can take that story any way you want. You can believe it or not. But Lester will tell you it was not him that was doing the healing. It was a power. It was a spirit. It was a belief that brought all this to bear. So that's what a healer is all about. That's what a medicine man is capable of doing, and many of them do. I went to a medicine man back in 1997 because I had tumors in my stomach, in my lower intestine. I was healed. Not with flame, thankfully, but I was healed nonetheless. So that's what a medicine man is. A Wichasha Wakan is a progression from that. When we talk about a Wichasha Wakan, we're talking about someone who is in their later years, who has gained not only experience, but the insight of wisdom as a human being to go along with his special calling. So those are the 2 differences between a healer and a holy man. And there are still those kinds of individuals in our society. So in the pre-reservation Lakota society, and by this chronologically I mean before the mid-1860s, because up until then we were still living the wild, free, nomadic life. And it wasn't until the mid-1860s when Red Cloud and some of his Oglalas surrendered to white authority in Nebraska that the concept of reservations being restricted on the reservation hit home for us. So in those days, in those times, a healer was an integral, important part of the village, the community, society. And there wasn't just one healer per village. There were several healers. But each one of them had an important role in the community. Each one was a necessary part of it. And because they were so important and necessary to the overall physical and spiritual well-being of the community, people took care of them. Of course, in our society, before the reservations, before you all came along, there was no materialism. The only way that medicine men were paid were through gifts from the community, gifts from people who were healed. And as the graphic says, sometimes the medicine man didn't have the time to go out and hunt for his family. So his family's needs were taken care of by the community at large. That's how important he was to the community, because he served a very necessary function. And every male in those days was trained to be 2 things, to fulfill 2 societal roles. One as a hunter, one as a warrior. Of course, everybody grew up to be parents, grandparents, so forth. But every male was trained to be a hunter and a warrior, as were medicine men, as were people who became medicine men. But sometimes they didn't participate in those because the thing that they were, the healer, the spiritual advisor, was much more important. So as I said, this is not a career choice. My nephew Lester had a dream. He didn't tell anyone about the dream. I'm not going to tell you what the dream is. But he had a dream, and he knew what the dream was saying. Essentially, they were saying, we want you. We pick you. And this happened when he was a young boy, probably about 13 or 14. And other medicine men in the community knew about the dream. Whether he told them or not, I don't know, but they knew about it. So they began to take him to their ceremonies, and teach him the fundamentals of being a medicine man, about healing plants, about the ceremonies, how to prepare a ceremony, how to dismantle an altar, all those things that are part of being a healer. He was taught when he was just a teenager. They were preparing him for the path that at that point he was still resisting. He was saying, hell no, I don't want this, because he knew what it was about. He wanted nothing to do with it. But in the end, he gave in. He didn't say yes cheerfully. He said, boy, I'm going to do this. No. It was a quiet, introspective decision because he knew what it entailed. He knew to some point what he was letting himself in for. And in some ways, to this day, he still regrets it. But at the same time, he understands what it's all about and what his role is as a healer. And I'm happy to say he was on his way to being a holy man as well. So what the heck is a spirit interpreter? I'm sure you've all seen TV programs about mediums, and people who commune with the dead, can see to the other side. That's what a medicine man does. Pure and simple. If you've ever been part of a Lakota healing ceremony, that's what it is. The medicine man or the healer is a focal point of the ceremony. He's the conduit through which these powers come. I'll tell you a little bit more about one of my grandfathers later on. But that's what happens. There are rituals involved. You just don't sit down and say, okay, come on, guys. There are rituals involved. There are songs. There are prayers. We have to do things in a certain way. We have to sit in a circle. The medicine man and his altar has to be in the center of the circle to face west. There are requirements, there are protocols, there are rituals that we don't have the time for me to explain to you. But that's what happens. And if we all come there in the right spirit, in the right frame of mind, respectful of the process, then the spirits will probably come. And each ceremony is for a specific purpose or more, to help somebody's illness, to help with some certain kind of a problem. And everybody who wants help comes to the ceremony and offers their prayers, and everybody offers prayers on their behalf. And the spirits come into the setting and they say, this is how we're going to help you. But you have to help yourself in a sense. These are what we want you to do. So this is what a medicine man does. This is what a healer does. This is how it happens. So that's what a spirit interpreter is. The spirits come to this person and they speak through this person. My nephew Lester is not full-blood Lakota. He's part Osage. He does not speak Lakota. He knows a few words, but he can't carry on a conversation. Like I can't carry on a conversation in English, he can't carry on a conversation in Lakota. But during the ceremony, when he's talking to the spirits, he speaks very fluent Lakota. And when the ceremony is over, he reverts to being lesser. Again, you can believe it or not. But that's what a spirit interpreter is. And this is what Black Elk was. First. This is what his practice was from the time he took up the pipe, took up the altar, until he became an older person. This is what he was. He was a healer, a spirit interpreter. That's what he did in a community. That was his calling. That was his role. That was his responsibility. That he took up willingly, if not regretfully. So after years and years of doing this, if a healer, if he happens to grow to old age, some of them don't. Because one of the things that a medicine man does, one of the things that a healer does, is he prays to take up somebody else's illness or disease or problems onto himself. He offers himself. So some of them don't live long. One of my great-grandfathers was a medicine man. He only lived to be 49. Died young because of that. So let's talk about him for a bit. His name was Good Voice Eagle, Wambali Hoashte. He was Sichangu Lakota. Both his parents were Sichangu Lakota. And he was first a healer and then a holy man. And we're not sure when he was born, because when he was born there were no paper birth certificates. So he thinks he was born about 1862. My grandmother thinks he was born around 1862. But we do know when he died, in 1911. He fell from a water tower that he was painting, helping to paint, in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, because at the time he was in prison. Therein is a whole nother story. And his specialty was to literally suck illnesses out of a person's body, no matter what it was. And that's what he would do. He would put the hand, he'd cup his hands like this, put himself over the affected area, and suck out the illness, and spit it out. That's what he did. And he was known far and wide for that ability. His helper, believe it or not, was a frog. And he would tell people, when they would ask him, well, where's that frog? And he would say, it's in here. It's inside, right? It helps me suck out that illness. And when he died, the moment he died, the moment he passed and his spirit left, people who were there with him, my grandmother, his wife, other people who were there with him, will tell you that a frog came out of his mouth. So he was right. He was in there. That was his helper. I never met him because I was way before I was born. I know a lot about him because of all the stories that my grandmother told of her father, the healer. But I know where he's buried. He's buried on a hillside, on a long sloping hillside, from a little stream called the Little White River. And it's near where my grandmother's land is. It's where my uncle, my mother's younger brother, still lives and has land. On some years, a patch of ground about this big as this room, is often greener than the rest of the hillside. And that's the area where he's buried. There were a couple instances where my cousins and I, because we used to have cattle, we were riding across that area looking for cattle, and the horses we were riding suddenly stopped of their own accord and perked their ears up and looked in the same direction. All 4 horses, or 3 or 4 horses, looked in the same direction at that hillside. We, of course, didn't see anything, but the horses did. And we had to wait until they stopped looking, until they decided to go again. But they were looking at something on that hillside. You can decide for yourself what that something or someone was. Probably my great-grandfather. He's probably going on. Who knows? When he died, he gave explicit instructions before he died not to put him in a casket. So his body was wrapped up in a blanket and 2 elk robes. And that's how he was laid into the ground. Because he didn't want a casket impeding his body's return to the earth. So his wishes were honored. So that's who one of my great-grandfathers was. And I grew up hearing about him, about some of the healings that he did, some of the people he healed. And I heard from some of the people he did heal. Some of them swear he saved their lives. Somewhere in the mid-1860s, when reservations became a reality for us, is when the white missionaries just descended on us. We had already, most of us, in the western part of our territory that you saw up on the screen, had already given into white authority. And most of us, Lakota people, were living in what is now northwestern Nebraska at a place called Camp Robinson or Fort Robinson, Nebraska. You can look it up or you can Google it. You'll find out. It's a historic site now. It was an active fort all the way through World War II. But that's where we were living, and about 10,000 to 15,000 people were located there at an agency on either side of the fort. So those were our first reservations. And in 1868, when we signed the Fort Laramie 1868 Treaty of Fort Laramie, that treaty designated the entire western half of the current state of South Dakota with the same boundaries as the Great Sioux Reservation. So that's the period I mean, and that's how it looked like in those days. So when we were all concentrated on those agencies, on those reservations, that's when the missionaries came. And the first thing they did was attack our spiritual beliefs. To say that they ridiculed it would be putting it mildly. They did everything to take it away from us. They did everything to trick us or cause us to begin to dislike our own beliefs. And one of the first things they did was work really hard to discredit medicine men. Because they knew the kind of influence that medicine men had on the community, on the village, on the people, on society. So they worked really hard to discredit healers, even to the point of throwing them in jail. So this is what happened to us. And one of the things it did, obviously, was they prohibited all the rituals and the ceremonies that went with our belief system, the healing ceremonies, the sun dance, and so forth. So, people were put in jail if they did those things. And not until 1878 did we have the legal wherewithal under the new system of the U.S. government to legally practice our rituals and our ceremonies. And why 1978? Because the American Indian Religious Freedom Act was passed. Not just for us Lakota, but for all Native tribes. So then and only then, it became legal for us to pray. Of course, up until then, if we wanted to go to church, Catholic Church, the Episcopal Church, or the Lutheran Church, or the Congregational Church, and pray, that's fine. But if we prayed from the basis of our spiritual beliefs, then we could get thrown in jail. When I was a boy of about 6 or 7, there was a medicine man who came down from one of the northern reservations in South Dakota, and he was doing a healing ceremony. And he did it along the Little White River Valley, and they picked a particular spot because of the water and because of the trees and so forth, where they built a temporary house, a little shelter, a round shelter. But I remember that several of us boys were strategically located on some of the high points on either side of the valley. Keep in mind, this was 1952. 1952. Our job was to be a lookout. We were supposed to sit there and watch in one direction, and if we saw the police or anybody coming, we were supposed to give a signal so they could shut down the ceremony and hide. This was 1952. That's part of my memory. And I was still young enough not to quite understand why. And my grandparents had a hard time explaining why. But that's still one of my boyhood memories. It's a good thing I know how to push a button, huh? So the unofficial motto of the federal government and the early missionaries, mainly the Catholic Church, was to kill the Indian and save the man. In other words, take our culture away from us. Take the very thing that identifies us as a Lakota community, as a Lakota person. Take it away from us. Then they could make us into whatever they felt. That was the approach. And one of the first things that would happen among many people was that they wondered, well, what's going to happen to our children and our grandchildren under the system? At one point, will there be no longer a Lakota society? At what point will the Lakota language die out? At what point will our spiritual practices and beliefs cease to exist? This is what those generations of people, my grandparents' generation, worried about. And of course, as adults, they hung on to what they knew and what they believed. But for kids, for children, it was a whole different thing. But people accepted Christianity. Either they accepted it sincerely, which a lot of people did. My grandparents were Christians, but they went. At least my grandmother was. I think my grandfather went along just to go along, just to keep peace in the household. And then some people did it in a way to learn more about the enemy. So what is it that they're all about? I mean, I would be curious, wouldn't you? So this was the effort. Kill the Indian and save the man. And what was the consequence? Now, I'm so proud of myself up to this point. There's a title of a book that a friend of mine wrote, Neither Wolf Nor Dog. It's about the boarding school era in that part of the country, Kent and Urban. So I'm borrowing his phrase, neither wolf nor dog. What does it mean? Simply this: you're not really Lakota anymore, but you're never going to be white either. So you're not either one of those. That's what it means. So even in this day and age, it's not uncommon for Lakota people to participate in both. I know people who do. They go to church on Sunday, whether it's the Episcopal Church or any other church, and then on Saturday night or Wednesday night, they go to a Lakota ceremony. People do that, and they're still doing it. And but there is a core population, and I'm one of them, who we're hanging on to who we are and what we are. I'm sort of an anomaly. My generation is probably the last generation to learn to speak Lakota as a first language. And I'm 73. 3 years ago, there was a study to count the number of first language Lakota speakers out of the Rosebud Sioux tribe's population of 38,000 people, and we were less than 2,000. There's less than that now. So that's what's happening to our belief system. And we are not practicing Christians. And some of us are anti-Christian, some of us are not. Some of us are more tolerant. But on the other hand, believe it or not, there are native Christians, Lakota Christians, who are anti-traditionalists, and rabidly so. So this is a situation that exists. And part and parcel is this is where Black Elk came from. This was his world. I'm sure you've heard of here we go here. Sitting Bull. I'm sure you've at least heard the name. Sitting Bull predated Black Elk. I don't know if they ever met. They lived at the same time. Sitting Bull was older. Black Elk was born in 1863. Sitting Bull died in 1890. He was killed in 1890. So who knows? The paths might have crossed. Sitting Bull was a healer. He was a medicine man. And he was a Wuchasha Wakan. He was a holy man. I don't know how old he was when he was killed. Sometimes people talk about him being in his 60s. I think he was older when he was killed. But he was a Hunkpapa Lakota. And early in his life, he was called to be a healer. But the reason we know about him is because he didn't stop at just being a healer. He was also a civilian leader. And he was a warrior. And he was a politician. He was an orator. He could hold an audience in the palm of his hand, as somebody would describe. In 1876, at the Battle of Little Bighorn, he was the preeminent political or civilian leader of all among the Lakota bands. That's how wide his reputation was. The preeminent military leader was Crazy Horse. But the reason I put Sitting Bull and Black Elk together is both of them were healers. Both of them were medicine men. Both of them became holy men. Both of them occupied the same kind of role, did the same kind of things for their people, just at different times. The only difference is Sitting Bull was staunchly anti-anything white, whereas Black Elk became a Catholic. So why do you suppose that happened? I'm sure you've heard, I'm sure you know about John Neihardt. John Neihardt was the one who really put Black Elk out there for the world to examine by writing about him. Black Elk Speaks. It's one of the most widely read books in the world. I went to Europe several times, and one of the questions that invariably comes up is, what do you think about Black Elk Speaks? So that's how widely known it is. But my question is, if Neihardt had not heard about Black Elk, would we be having this conversation this evening? What is it that set Black Elk apart for Neihardt that he was curious enough to go and say, okay, what are you all about? Talk to me. Give me your perspective on this and that and so forth. If that hadn't happened, we wouldn't have been having this conversation. Because the underlying message here is this. Crazy Horse, even though you might have heard about him as a very famous military leader and the one tactician responsible for the demise of Custer at Little Bighorn, he was not by any means the only warrior leader at Bighorn. There were many others, but he's the only one that we know about or that you've heard about. Same goes for Black Elk. Same goes for Sitting Bull. They were not the only healers among the Lakota. There were others. a lot of others, even now, today, on my home reservation. I don't know about all, I know several of the medicine men, I don't know them all, but they're there. They're there. And that was the same situation in Black Elk's time. There were other healers. Maybe it was the fact that he became a Catholic that prompted Neihardt. And because he did that, he certainly set himself up for criticism from his own kind. And those are the reasons we're having the discussion this evening. People, and maybe some of you, regard, because of the fact that Black Elk became a Catholic, regard him as a visionary. What is a visionary? I don't know. Somebody who sees something that we don't? Somebody who achieves a perspective or a perception that we don't? Probably. Keep in mind, English is my second language, so I'm struggling with how to define it, what a visionary is. But it's all about perception, being able to have a certain kind of perception, is it not, to be a visionary? Is that why Black Elk joined the Catholic Church? Because he was a visionary? Or was it just old-fashioned curiosity? How does the other half live? Why do they do what they do? Why do they kneel when they pray? Why do they sing what they sing? Those are the questions that come into my mind when my grandmother would drag me along to Episcopal church services. So why wouldn't Black Elk think the same thing? But I'm sure he was looking for something else. I'm sure he was trying to get at the core. This is my perception. I'm sure he was getting at the core of why are these people the way they are? Why do they believe what they believe? I mean, it's one thing to say, this is what I believe, isn't it? But to say, so you have to give up what you believe because it's not as good as what I believe, so you can believe what I believe. There's a big difference, isn't there? And I think that's what he was curious about, that attitude. Why these people regarded the Lakota as not quite as good as. I'd be curious about that. I'm curious about it. At this point in our time and at this point in my life, that's what I'm curious about. Why is what's happening in this country happening? What causes those attitudes? What causes those hurtful words, those condescending, paternalistic, racist words to come out of people's mouth? Why? I want to know. I really want to know. So I can either avoid it or do something about it. So I can teach my children and grandchildren about what I've learned. I think that's what was driving Black Elk. To see what makes the other side tick. Makes sense to me, doesn't it? And for that, he's called a visionary, and I'm completely in agreement with that. The funny part about it was, even though he occupied this status, this lofty status, if you will, in his own society, in his own community, he was revered for what he was as a holy man, for a Wichasha Waka. He was held in high esteem. And once he joined the Catholic Church, he was like a plebe. He was like a recruit, a raw recruit. He had to start at the bottom. What he was as a Lakota holy man, what he was as a Lakota healer, meant nothing in the other context, as far as I can see. Why? I don't know. I really don't. But it is a fact that on one side, he's up here, on the other side, he's down here. That's the fact. You can decide why. But I do know that he was sort of regarded as a prize. Look, we have black elk. Black elk has come over to our side. So can you. Makes sense, doesn't it? So what we've been talking about sort of is my assessment, the Marshall assessment, if you will. And black elk was just as human as you or I. And I say that because of the stories I've heard about my great-grandfathers who were medicine men. I say that because I see my nephew growing and developing and stumbling and falling as a human being in addition to being a medicine man. We all share that foible. We're all humans. We're all susceptible to making mistakes. And I'm not saying black elk made a mistake. I'm just saying that perhaps this whole intensive effort of killing the Indian and saving the man had an effect, because that effort was very intense and very extensive, even into the 20th century. My father, Joseph II, had sandy-colored hair and blue eyes. He was quite French. His French blood came through. When he was in the 8th grade at the Rosebud boarding school in Rosebud, South Dakota on the Rosebud Reservation, he broke the cardinal rule and was caught speaking Lakota. Big no-no. Biggest one there is, in addition to praying. So they made him kneel on a 2x4. You know what a 2x4 is? They made him kneel on a 2x4 in front of the principal's office for an entire afternoon. I tried doing it, so I know how hard it is. This is what my dad had to go through. I want to see what it feels like. The second time he was caught, they hung him up by his thumbs over a pipe in the basement, water pipe in the basement. So to keep his thumbs and his shoulders from dislocating, he had to stand on his tiptoes until he had cramps in his calf muscles. That's when he was in the 8th grade, 1930-something. So that's how I can describe to you how intensive it was, this killing the Indian and saving the man, well into the 20th century. And black elk had to have felt some of that. Black elk had to have wondered about it. Why are they doing this? Why? Why is it so all-fired important for them, for us to be Christians, for us to be like them, for us to think like them? What is it about what they think that's so important that ours is not, or we are not? I would have had those thoughts. I have those thoughts. But in the end, when he was about to die, he grabbed his pipe and he told his daughter, "This is what I believe in, the pipe religion." I share that sentiment. I'm there with him. Because at the end, he couldn't forsake what he was. He couldn't just say it, throw it aside, any more than I could. I was baptized in Episcopalian. Of course, I was only 7 months old at the time. I didn't have a choice. But when I got to the point where I could make a choice, I chose this path. I chose to honor what I am as a Lakota person, not just biologically and by bloodline, but by philosophy and belief. That's who and what I am, and that's who and what Black Elk was. When all was said and done, all the words were written about him, all the stuff that was said about him, he reverted back to what he was, what he had always been. There's a little town called Mission, South Dakota, on the Rosebud Reservation. And I don't know how many churches there are in that town, of 1,000 people. Probably about 20 churches. Some are Catholic, some are Episcopalian. I drove by a sign just the other day when I was up there visiting my mom. The sign above the church door said, Lakota Church of Christ. Now there's an oxymoron if I ever saw it. And that's a prime example of cultural appropriation. It's a way to suck us in to walking through their doors. To me, it's very simple. Either you're Christian or you're not. You can be black and be a Christian. You can be Lakota and be a Christian. But be a Christian. And if you want to forsake your own kind and your own culture, fine, do it. The two will never mix. And I'll bet you that's what Black Elk found out. One has to be true to what one is. Because every man, every person, man or woman who has reached that age, as my grandmothers did when they were older, in their 80s, and my grandfathers, and that generation did. One thing that they taught was, in your life, the one thing you need to do is to do good and to learn and leave something better than you found it. That kind of philosophy, that kind of thinking, that kind of teachers crosses a lot of lines, does it not? That's good advice for all of us to follow, no matter what we believe, no matter what our cultural and spiritual and religious foundation is, to do good, to learn, and to leave something better than you found it. Makes sense to me. And these were Lakota people who were telling me that. These were culturally Lakota people who were telling me that's our purpose in life. And who knows? Maybe Black Elk was trying to see if that was the Catholic purpose. That's why I think canonization is ridiculous. I hope I never see, take it for what it's worth. I hope I never live to see or hear Saint Black Elk. To me, it doesn't mix. This is not disparaging anything or any institution. He was not a Catholic. He learned about being Catholic. He walked the walk for a while. But in the end, I think he reverted to what he was. And in our eyes, it would diminish his status as a Lakota holy man, because once that title came, if it comes, it would overshadow everything else that he was. And I, as a Lakota traditionalist, for one, don't want that to happen. I hope it doesn't. I know it is done out of a sense of goodness, out of a sense of sincerity, but I don't think it should happen. So finally, and maybe you're thinking thankfully, I leave this with you, and obviously it's translated from the Lakota. This is was part of Black Elk's vision. And I'll leave it with you to read and to think about. And let me read it for you. We'll try to figure it out together. And while I stood there, I saw more than I can tell. And I understood more than I saw. For I was seeing in a sacred manner the shape of all things in spirit, and the shape of all shapes as they must live together like one being. You tell me what that means. See, that's part of being that Uchasha Wakan. That's part of rising to that level where you can have perceptions that other people can't and never will. But what he does is he turns around and says, okay, this is what I saw, and I'll tell you. And it's up to you to figure it out. What do you think he means, seeing in a sacred manner? Does that somehow mean piously? No, I don't think so. When you think of the word, Lakota word Wakan, it's translated in several different ways. Wakan can mean holy. It can mean sacred. It can mean mysterious. It can mean something beyond description. So which one of those is this? And what was he seeing? Better question is, why was he seeing it? Because he had reached a level of perception that many of us will not. But because of these words, because of what he taught, we can try to understand what he was talking about. I mean, how long has it been since all of the people on this planet have been divided into what we call the 4 races of men? How long ago was that? Who started that ridiculousness? It was me. That's all I know. Couple that question with this. And maybe you can come up with an answer. So who do I think Black Elk was? Black Elk was a man, a very human man, a Lakota man, a product of his environment, a product of his society, his culture, his upbringing. He answered a calling. Crazy Horse answered a calling to be a warrior. Black Elk answered a calling to be a healer, like my nephew has, like my great-grandfathers did. And I'm sure there were many times he regretted that decision. But he answered it. He fulfilled his purpose. He did good things. He learned. And he left things better than he found them. Because he taught us things, if we're willing to learn them. That's who Black Elk is. Thank you for listening. Yeah, there have been medicine women, but not as many. But there have been medicine. There have been women like that. And you gotta. He certainly was. He even helped to revive the Sundance while he was a Catholic catechist. A definite yes. And also yes to the first part, because I think that he didn't share all of his visions with us. He didn't share everything that he saw when he went to this otherworldly place and perceived things that have happened or might have happened. But he came away probably being really, really fearful of what might come. So I think you might be right. I'm okay with it. I'm fine. Yeah, I mean. It's better than yeah. Harney. Yeah, it's much better than Harney, obviously. As those of you who know that Harney Peak was named that after General, I forget his first name, General Harney, who had a definite hand in killing a lot of Lakota women and children, just to put it in a nutshell. And so they named a mountain after him, sort of like Mount Rushmore. So yeah, Black Elk Peak is much, to me, more preferable than the former name. And to me, it's fitting. Yeah. Tragic. Well, we're starting to stop it a little bit. I did a thesis years ago in school on the rate of decline of the language. This was back, I don't want to say how long ago that was, but even then it wasn't good, because then we were talking about 30% of the population speaking Lakota, and it was on the decline. Now, as I said, it's less than that. So what's happening on Rosebud and Pine Ridge is people are not waiting for the universities and the schools to take up the responsibility. Communities are getting together and they're organizing Lakota language immersion camps for children and adults. And people are participating in that. So it's a start of a resurgence in reclaiming the language.
I believe they're doing that in Plymouth,
yeah, it's sort of a countrywide, a nationwide thing. Yeah, it really is. So I'm hopeful that if it continues, then the trend will be stopped. It has to be stopped before it's reversed. So I'm hopeful. Yeah. Oh, write to your congressman, write letters, send them texts, emails these days. Yeah, annoy them as much as you can. Make sure you're aware of the problem. What they did, I'm sure you probably know, they passed a law that said every voter had to have a physical address, and on reservations that just doesn't happen. So that suppressed a lot of voters. Yeah.
We have time for one more question.
One more. Well, anything's possible, and I think, to me, I'm a very simple-minded person. So I have a tendency to reduce things to the simplest equation. If two differing groups of people, if two differing opinions and philosophies learn about one another, not with the intent of melding and forming a new way of thinking, but simply learning about each other, that's where the bridges are built. And it's understanding, not a melding of ways. And the more we understand about each other, the more we can honestly and clearly say, well, here's the reasons I like you, or here are the reasons I don't like you. But at least it's honest. So I'm in favor of those kinds of things, not to form a new path, but to foster understanding. Yeah. Right. Thank you.